Good evening from the Gail Lamon Auditorium in the Captain Willie Miller Building on the campus of Embry-Riddle. Welcome to the Embry-Riddle Speaker Series. Tonight, we take a step back. Tonight, our presentation is being made by two excellent benefactors, two wonderful people who fell in love with the university years ago, Harry and Ada Lamon. To speak on their behalf tonight, as they could not make this trip, is my good friend, the Reverend David Keck, who joins us now to talk a little bit about the people who made tonight possible. David?
Good evening. We want to thank Harry and Ada Lamon for indeed making this evening possible. Over about 30 years ago, Harry and Ada fell in love with this university. They were not affiliated with the university, but they heard about it through a friend. And Harry served on the board for over 25 years. And he fell in love with the place, its vision of a university for aviation and aerospace. And he'd been involved with most of the major decisions over the past 25 years. So students, as you realize and you walk through the place, just remember that folks like the Board of Trustees members who are here providing leadership and guidance. And this particular evening, we want to thank Harry and Ada for their generosity. Not just the vision that they have, it's a very hopeful vision for the university, but also their generosity in making this possible. The theme that Harry and Ada hold so dearly is the theme of servant leadership. And their desire is to work with our community here and to help us, particularly our students, develop into student leaders. And Harry describes this following Robert Greenleaf, someone he'd studied, as a method or a practice, a set of habits, servant leadership that, quote, enriches the lives of individuals, builds organizations, and ultimately creates a more just and caring society. All in about 75 minutes tonight. Harry realizes, Ada realizes, they both understand that these are lifelong habits and commitments, but if we don't have a university that's helping its students wrestle with the big questions, asking questions of life, the meaning of the universe and everything, where will students develop the habit of asking? And so Harry's question tonight, as we were preparing for this, he said he just wants students to ask, what are life's big questions and how do you want to live them out in your own lives? What are the big questions and how do you want to live them out in your own lives? And in today's idiom, I would say, now's when we drop the microphone and challenge the students to respond. However, I know our IT people don't like it when we drop the microphone. But there's a strong sense that this is a challenge to live a good and meaningful life, live a thoughtful life, a life that makes a difference for others. And so Harry and Ada have sponsored the speaker series, and we're so glad to have with us tonight Professor Gary Laderman from Emory University. He is chair of the Department of Religion and the Goodrich C. White Professor. He is the author of Sacred Matters, Celebrity Worship, Sexual Ecstasies, The Living Dead, and Other Signs of Religious Life in the United States. He's also written 2 books on death in America, The Sacred Remains, and A Cultural History of Death in the Funeral Home in 20th Century America. He received his BA in Psychology from California State University, Northridge, his MA and PhD from Religious Studies Department at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He teaches courses on U.S. religious history, mind, medicine, and healing, death and dying, theory and method, introduction to religion, Native American religions, health and healing, and American religious cultures. Professor Laderman, thank you so much for being with us today.
Great pleasure. Good evening, and thank you for being here, Gary. Appreciate it. Professor, I want to begin by asking, what is the role, really, of universities? And I know it depends. There are different universities, private as well as state-run universities, but how do they begin by teaching students to ask the big questions? Where do they start?
There's a long history of, I think, education being interested in the big questions. Very aware of, what we have to face in the 21st century and thinking about education in the 19th or 18th century. The kinds of big questions that were asked in the 18th or 19th century, I think, are similar to what's being asked today. And education provides you a different kind of space in which to reflect and think about issues that you don't get an opportunity to when you're working or when you're at home or when you're in church. And so it's a long-standing tradition in thinking in the liberal arts about what is it we should be thinking about and how should we be educating young people turning into young adults.
I'm thinking as you were speaking, going back to the 1800s, their question might be, how will I survive?
Well,
and today, too, but they're also wondering, will I get a job?
Right.
Does that rise to the top?
I think that's an absolute driver in education today, and you may have different opinions about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it is a thing. It is a reality, and at least as I experience it in my university, students come in already pretty directed in where they want to go and thinking about career preparation. So my job, I feel, in the humanities is to break out of that and to get them to begin thinking about questions that I find central to the big questions that I sense are what have historically been very much a part of human nature. Questions about death, questions about sexuality, questions about religion, questions about health and healing. Those are, whether you're in the 21st century or the, 18th century, I think those are pretty much pretty consistent concerns.
Is it a primary responsibility of universities to give an open look at, say, the political life that's out there, expose them to both sides so they know what's out there and then they can make choices for themselves? Is that a responsibility of higher ed to showcase, where a nation or a community is politically?
You can't escape politics. I think politics will enter into your family life, your career, education. I don't think you can escape it. And the university is really, I don't know, I think in some ideal sense, is supposed to be about knowledge and understanding the ways in which people interpret their reality and make sense of their reality, but also, train them to have a better grasp some of the basic issues that people should be thinking about, whether it's, thinking about public health or thinking about law and legal issues or thinking about medicine.
Can you define a big question? What's an example of a big question?
What is the purpose of life? I think the big questions, again, are going to be common whether you're in India or Africa or South America. What is my purpose? How do I understand myself in the cosmos? Why is there death? How do I understand aging? These are, for me, inherently religious questions, but they're also consistently human, universal questions that are often tied to basic biological realities. We are mortal. We are sexual. We age. Forget about the questions of God and whether there's an afterlife. It's about you and me embodied and embodies that suffer and feel pleasure and that also ultimately decompose.
Is there sometimes a conflict for students who, when they're asking the big questions, religion versus science and how they square the two? If they're devoutly religious, that their faith could be in conflict with science?
Absolutely. I think that certainly, especially for young kids who are just coming out of high school and who think they know what they think, who think they know who they are. And when they are immersed in a university college setting, the best of them will get them to challenge those questions. But certainly, you know, people will come in and have religious views even as they're learning about evolution or about physics. And, you know, that's what we all have to wrestle with in some sense. I think the best universities don't try to, you know, squelch out that, you know, personal kind of views of how they understand these big questions.
Here's where I put him on the spot. Your career has basically been Emory University, I believe, well over 20 years, correct?
That is correct.
I don't want to load it too much, but you've been there for a long time.
Yes.
So I'm asking you, because of the diversity of what is offered at Emory, do you believe that professors are capable of going deep into the big question? Are they capable of going deep?
At a place like Emory, certainly.
In general, but Emory first.
Well, at Emory, I think absolutely. That's what we do in the Department of Religion. That's what I think they do in the Department of Political Science, or I think the Department of Biology is, you know, there's a luxury to being involved in liberal arts that is both, you know, on the one hand trying to train students and get them to acquire the knowledge they need to succeed later in life, but also to, you know, allow for the introduction of big questions. I think in theory that's what general education is supposed to allow for again, I mean, we're talking about 18-year-olds to 21, 22-year-olds. You know, it's just, this is a great time to get them to allow, you know, be thinking about the bigger questions. Emory, certainly. Other universities, as I've said, Embry-Riddle, I'm not sure they allow for that kind of big questions as a part of their education, as a part of classroom discussions. Big state universities, it's going to be very different. I'm very much in many ways insulated in the ivory tower, and I totally realize that.
You get your BA, I think, from California State, Northbridge?
Northbridge, yeah.
Okay. And you were there for, you know, one period in your life, and then you come to Emory. Do you believe that students look at things the same way on the left coast as they do on the far right coast?
Absolutely not.
Go with that, sir.
There are great differences. It's been an incredible experience coming to the South from the West Coast.
And if I don't miss my guess, you didn't plan to be in the South. You wanted to go anywhere that wasn't going to be in the South, right?
Yeah, that's part of the story. Yeah, I'm just coming out of a PhD program at University of California, Santa Barbara, which I hope you've all been there, and if you haven't, you should go. I dream of it every night, as I've said. But coming out of a great PhD program in religious studies, I was, and this is in the 90s, ready to go anywhere in the country, and just really wanted to get a job wherever I could, except I said to my wife, I'll go really anywhere except the South. And of course, it turned out I had interviews at Rice and at Duke and at Emory, and I understood that my destiny was in the South. Things are different here. I'll quickly say, we can maybe come back to it in questions. I went to a state school, and that's where I got my PhD. So it was very secular, and theology was out the door. No one wanted to talk about it. It wasn't part of my education, doctoral training, all of that. And I had a great education at Santa Barbara, but that was a huge mistake because it didn't prepare me for the rest of the country, if not the world. That is, that theology and religion, you can't separate them. You can't think that you can only have an academic kind of scientific study of religion that doesn't include theological sort of faith commitment perspective.
Okay.
And so I wasn't prepared for the real world in a lot of ways. And Emory cured me of that pretty quickly because it's a private institution with a seminary, a theology school, as well as a Department of Religion, which is where I am located.
Because you're a historian, you offer a unique perspective on this issue. We had a doctor of theology speak to us a couple of years ago that said that he believes that students who carry their faith, whatever it is, with them and incorporate it as part of their student life actually turn out better than those who have no connection to faith. Do you believe that to be true?
I don't, it depends. I think more and more students, as you know, are non-affiliated. So the number of nuns, N-O-N-E-S, in the religious landscape is the highest growing, it's the fastest growing segment of the American religious pie. And it is primarily millennials, but also baby boomers. So, you know, I think it's hard to know exactly, you know, what it means to have faith, especially as you're going through your college years, and how that can be, you know, kind of factored into predicting how things may turn out.
One Baptist minister and professor said, the most frustrating thing for us is to put them through school, protect them at home, we turn them out to college, and they leave the church. Is this an isolated statement, or do you think that it's very common?
I think that it's probably more common than not. And education is a mind-altering, mind-opening experience if it's good. And so that's what happens when you become adult, is you start thinking for yourself. And you move outside of what had been the primary sources of authority, moral authority, religious authority, spiritual authority, that have often, you know, been formative in shaping you. Your parents and home life and your religious affiliation. Those things, in many cases, fall by the wayside as you go off to college.
We had a radio listener who asked, please discuss with Professor Laderman this following issue. We are setting a bad example as a society for students who, as they go through the university system, are watching discourse in this country, an election that has energized people on one side or the other. So it comes to civility, Professor Laderman. Do we need to teach civility, and because students could come out and not be civil? I mean, we're setting a bad example with the political arguments.
Right.
Does the university should a university ask the big questions or help direct to have civil disagreements?
Absolutely. And again, in an ideal world, this is what happens. And I try to enforce it in my own classrooms, where it is all about civil discourse and respecting other people's views, different views, as we come together and talk about a particular topic, whether it's U.S. religious history or, you know, it is looking, you know, again, at death and dying. It's, you know, I think it's important in an educational context that people are open to ideas. I think there may be limits to that as well. As I've said, if someone in my class started talking about sort of KKK ideology or Nazi ideology as something that was relevant and important to the discussion, I would find it offensive and probably shut it down. So I mean, there are limits to what we allow in civil discourse, but I also think it's you know, it's very difficult to navigate and negotiate all that. But in a classroom setting, you know, that's what I try to facilitate: openness, but also understanding and respecting other people.
Might it be summed up this way too, that maybe consciously or unconsciously you think, is this helpful? In other words, in the discussion, if this isn't helpful, why pursue it? Yeah,
well, sometimes things aren't helpful and can be difficult, and I don't want to shut those out necessarily. But you know, again, this is all part of the, as you were saying, this is the climate we're in, where certain kinds of discourse, I think, have, you know, has been allowed in ways that is not so much about tolerance and opening up a kind of democracy of ideas, but that leads to shutting down conversations and not being able to get at big ideas that maybe people don't answer in the same way.
Does dogma exist at universities across the country, do you think? In other words, you shut down, there's one theory, that's it, there's no opening. Is that common?
I think that sums up science. Oh, no, sorry, that's going to get me in a lot of trouble, right? Science, yeah, dogma, science, you didn't expect that. Dogma, dogma. I mean, it depends a lot on the specifics you're talking about. I think there are questions about the limits of sort of free speech and academic, in the academic context. And we've seen a number of issues come up where, people are brought to campuses and have a more conservative or, even stronger extreme views, and students who are protesting or revolting or, even engaged in certain acts of violence. That's really problematic. I'm not sure how to negotiate all of that, but I think it gets back to academic freedom and thinking about, what kind of culture do we live in, especially in terms of public culture, and in terms of language and discourse that we feel is helpful, is constructive, is somehow moving America forward, or not. Again, I don't have all the answers there.
Do universities listen enough to what the students want to know more about? And I'm not talking about coursework. I'm talking about the different aspects, life and death, be it sex, drugs. Are universities listening to what the students say they want more information about, do you think?
I think they are, because what matters these days more than at any other time that I've been involved in this profession are enrollments. So what classes are drawing students? And that is a major driver in thinking about sort of, does the university endorse and support these kinds of more big question focus classes or not? Or is it just the sort of, you learn your specialization, you've really got to be career oriented. So again, speaking from my experience, I've been very fortunate at Emory, but I have classes that bring in 200, 250 students at Emory, which is a small, fairly medium-sized university. Death and dying, as I mentioned, it's huge, 250. Religion and sexuality, students want to talk about that.
They do.
Is that a big surprise? That's not a surprise, absolutely. And those are big questions. That, I don't know. I may be assuming too much, but the big questions are coming out, and I feel, in those classes, and students are flocking to them. They want to talk about death. They want to talk about sexuality. And I teach another course of religion and music. I have not to talk all about myself, I have another colleague who just last semester taught a course called Black Love. And it was a class that was huge, 90 students, but also created a sort of social media viral sensation because there were so many stories about this course. So, it takes the creativity of, I hope, faculty members to hear and to get a sense of where students are and what topics can be strategic to get them to think beyond just, I need to learn about microbiology or I need to learn about accounting.
Should universities...
So you could have big questions in accounting and microbiology, I'm not talking
Especially now, sir.
Yeah.
Should universities teach servant leadership? Or is that something that comes naturally? that someone aspires to serve based on an interest that they may have. Do we need to showcase what servant leadership is?
More and more, I think we do, and the best universities are leading the way in that, because it's, well, again, I may be exaggerating, but it seems like now more than ever, it can't just be education and the acquisition of knowledge, but that somehow it isn't just about pre-professional or preparing people for their career, but to think about civic engagement, to think that education is also about helping students to find their place and their passions, and to encourage and nurture that in students.
You wrote 2 books about death, correct?
That's a lie.
Oh.
No, I did, yes, I did. I'm sorry.
Why?
2 books about death, yes.
How is it that you went in that direction? What brought you to write the books?
Wow. I never get that question. But I've thought about it a lot.
You never get that question.
No, I'm joking.
Yeah, I think. You didn't know there was a comedic part to this. To go.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote 2 books on death. One looks at the impact of the Civil War on American attitudes toward death. And of course, the bottom line story there is that before the Civil War, there's no embalming. After the Civil War, embalming becomes the foundation of the funeral industry that dominates the 20th century. So the second book is a sequel to that book. So I'm writing a sequel to a book that no one really read, but I couldn't get it out of my system. And it's called Rest in Peace. And it looks at the history of the funeral home in the 20th century. So those are the 2 books that I wrote and that I
Is your next edition 1 page, cremation?
yeah, well, right, I tried to veer away from it.
We discussed this earlier today.
But that's a big topic. So yeah, I've written 2 books about death, and how did I get onto the topic? The big question. I was taking psychology courses, I was a major in psychology, I was taking some religion courses, but it became really clear as an undergraduate that why study anything else if you really want to understand human
I want to stay with this for a moment, because it appears that, and we discussed it earlier today at lunch, 22% of all Americans plan their funerals. A growing number have moved toward cremation, largely because of cost. Is there a societal, because you're a historian, is there a societal movement away from the way that end-of-life experiences have been happening, moving away from funerals to more simplistic closures for individuals?
Everything's changing. It's a dramatic, radical, revolutionary change, I think, in the moment we're living in when it comes to death and rituals around death. I would say that what's interesting about what you mentioned, that is people who are pre-planning and deciding for less expensive rituals, ceremonies, that's unprecedented. You know, never really in human history do people really plan their own funerals in the way that we're seeing people do it today. I mean, certainly kings and in some cultures there is some pre-arrangement, but not like in the kind of culture we live in today. So historically, that's unprecedented in American history. And when people plan their own funerals, they want them to be less expensive and less of an imposition on the living. When people, like for most of American history, weren't planning their own funerals, the prices were exuberant. I mean, it was such an incredible cost because the grievers, the people who were mourning, really felt they needed to do right by the dead in ways that led to really expensive funerals. So when people who are thinking about their own funerals pre-plan, they want to pre-plan in ways that are less expensive. And so I think the economics of that is interesting as it relates to pre-planning. But just to go back to what you were saying it's all changing. And there are older traditions that used to keep most funerals pretty standard in white communities and black communities, in Christian communities and Jewish communities, is gone. And cremation is a huge factor.
This comes at an especially solemn time here at Embry-Riddle. We lost a student, a very beloved young person. I'm going to ask my colleague once again, David Keck, to speak a little of this young lady who passed just recently.
Thank you. One of the things that we wrestle with is the fact that a young person died suddenly, and as a community, we absorb that grief, we struggle with it, we wrestle with it because of some of the changes that Professor Laderman is talking about. We don't necessarily have the history, the tradition, the knowing what to do. And so one of the things we wrestle with is how do you respond? How do you help students for whom this may be their first experience of the death of someone they love or care about? How do you help a family that comes from all across, from the other side of the planet? She was from Australia. How do you help the faculty and staff who are also grieving? And so as a community, we need help in thinking through the questions about meaning and what are the ways in which this becomes an occasion for us to say, what does it mean to be a friend? I think that's would be a big question. What does it mean to be mortal? What does it mean to realize that my friend is mortal? And how is that going to change my daily life? How is that going to change my behavior? How is that going to lead me to either ignore it and hope that it never happens again, or to say, I'm at a university, I'm here to learn, I'm here to discover what it means to be human, and to figure out how to live that out. So these are some of the things we're wrestling with right now as a community. I'm proud to say that this is a good place to be when something bad happens, because people are, let's like to use the word to rally. Folks are coming together, they're asking, what can we do, how can I help? In one sense, there's nothing we can do. On the other hand, there's a lot that we can do. And the simplest acts of support, the simplest acts of love, the simplest acts of sitting beside someone and putting your arm around them become very powerful and very potent indeed. So that's some of the ways in which we're wrestling, and that's why these questions of the big questions are so important, because if we admit that we're human, we discover we can't avoid asking these things.
Thank you, David. In this context, what responsibility or role should universities play in the discussion of the topic with students? Do they wait for students to ask? Do they automatically set up some sort of grief counseling? What role should universities play when a member of the student body passes?
Hugely supportive and trying to work with the students who are most affected to prepare some kind of ceremonies or rituals that the university can sponsor and support, in addition to the other kinds of memorializations that are going to be happening. And I think universities, I don't want to talk, use metaphors of family, but university is an important place to embrace its students, and students sort of, need that. And this is all very sad and tragic, and sadly, this is not uncommon. Last semester, while I was teaching Death and Dying, an Emory student died, and many of the students who were in my class when this student passed, and you can imagine how difficult that was, but also, and I heard from students that in some ways, being able to both grieve, but also to try to think in whatever kind of intellectual capacity was possible was also helpful. So universities aren't communities, they're not families, but they do provide certain kinds of networks of support that that students can use as a resource and to help them through something like this.
In general, this is a curiosity question based on your history. Would you hazard an opinion as to what percentage of young people who are enrolled in universities have some working knowledge of what a death experience is like? Would you say half, more than half, in general? And I realize there are no absolutes and it varies in different cultures.
It's a great question and would be good to survey to get a more accurate sense. I do ask my students in the death and dying class, have they ever seen a corpse? And what I've noticed over the years is that 10, 15 years ago, it was a very small percentage. And more recently, more and more students are willing to admit to that. You know, again, what is the circumstances, the context, I'm not asking the specifics, but my sense is that more and more students are in some ways encountering death.
What role, if any, does grief recovery counseling play in this? Is it huge? Is it overstated? Is it big?
That's an important question. I think that there's a role that these grief counselors can play, and it's important for students to be able to, you know, as cliche as it is, have someone to talk to and share their feelings with. Because, I hope I can say this, I mean, this is different than a pet dying or a grandparent dying. So the scripts that we have to talk about this aren't, you know, easily at hand. And so I think that they have an important role to play.
I read something in the Wall Street Journal about this topic that said that 95%, I found this extraordinary, and I found it hard to believe, 95% of college-bound students have had no close experience with death. That seems to be a bit high. Do you think that that number is lower, in your opinion?
It could be. I think it's hard to know. I mean, people live longer. You know, this is, as I write about in my books, I mean, before the Civil War, death was so much a part of the fabric of life. I mean, everybody was dying. People weren't living beyond, I'd be dead, people were living beyond 30, 40, 50, infant mortality. I mean, a whole different landscape of death that was everywhere. After the 20th century, into the 20th century, part of what I write about too is the simultaneous rise of funeral homes and hospitals in the 20th century as new mediators between the living and the dead, the funeral director and the doctor. You know, hospitals also didn't exist really before in the 19th century as they do in the 20th century. So there are these new mediators who really step in and are specialists when it comes to death. So part of that also has to do with a mortality revolution. Again, because of new developments in public health and medicine, people are, as I said, living longer in the 20th century. So the experience of death is much more limited. It's not so much I can, have someone close to me die. I think what is interesting is in the 20th century, it's not the reality of death in everyday life that is dominant, but how death becomes very prominent in popular culture. That's where most people experience death, is in films, in television, in their music.
This may be a little off the subject, but I'm wondering, as it relates to death, the amount of imagery that we all see, but let's keep it to young people, whether it be video games, violent movies, violent television shows, do they become somehow anesthetized to the whole thing, and then when death really does happen, they don't get the full impact because they've seen so many images? Or is that not true?
I think it's worth study. I don't know definitively what the answer is, but it's a curious cultural question because, as I see it, America especially is saturated with violence, and it's not something that's new in the 21st century, but has been consistently a part of the American imagination. Violence is inherently sacred in many cases, but also inherently a part of the American story. So I think that, even with that understanding of violence is so pervasive in our imagination and what we're attracted to, that doesn't necessarily impede or inhibit the kind of authentic emotional experience of death that people have when someone close to them dies.
I'm going to come to some of our distinguished people up front for a comment and or question to contribute to this discussion, but one more question, and that relates this time to sexuality, morality. With the amount of imagery, once again, that is available in the open market through advertising on billboards, television, cable, phones, is it more of a struggle in this generation for young students than it was before as to what road they take as it regards to morality?
Definitely. As a parent of two kids, 18 and 20-year-olds, two guys who love rock and roll. I mean, what do you think? Absolutely. Morality is no longer within the confines of the church or what your pastor says. It is in Beyonce, and it is in, the Guardians of the Galaxy. I think popular culture is more than ever a huge influence on how we think about what is right and what is wrong and what we aspire to and the meaning of death. This is, you guys are getting a sense. My sense of the sacred and religious life extends far beyond the mosque, the temple, the church, but is very much a part of a larger swath of our cultural life.
I would assume that it's become even more important for spirituality centers of any kind to be on campuses across this country. Something that is neutral, that allows it to be safe for all faiths to share the facility and to share the counsel. I have to think that now it's even more valuable than it ever was.
And it's like it never was this way. I mean, the idea that you have more than just facilities for Christians and Jews is pretty revolutionary in its own way. And is it good? Is it beneficial? I think absolutely. As an institutional acknowledgement of the reality of our lives, which is people are different when it comes to religion.
We're going to take some questions from the audience, but first, I want to come out to our front row of panel that we've invited to be here to speak. And I want to come to you first, Reverend Bracey, for some thoughts that you might want to contribute to our discussion.
He covered a large, wide expanse. Let me just introduce myself. I'm Randolph Bracey, Dean of the School of Religion at Bethune-Cookman University. And I served as a pastor for 35 years, both in Pennsylvania as well as Florida. And in the course of those 35 years, I must have buried perhaps 200 plus individuals. And I've watched how the folkways and mores have impacted upon how we look at death, especially in the Black community. For instance, when I started as a pastor some 35 years ago, little things such as when I would do marriage counseling, a couple might be cohabitating, but they had so much respect for the pastor that they wouldn't even mention it. Today, it's accepted that they shack. I say that just to show you that how large the expanse is. I heard you make a statement about cremation. I think more than ever now, when I started, if you were, and I a Baptist pastor, if you will, people were very much concerned about, especially if they had money, they believed in the theology of bodily resurrection, if you will. So that meant you did not burn a person, okay? There's that thing in Jewish theology called Gehenna, that you didn't do that. But today, finances play a very large role. For instance, I started a church in Orlando about 25 years ago, and we had about 330 individuals that started with me. But since those 25 years, the numbers have dwindled to the extent now that every time someone passes, they call me to do the funeral. So this past Saturday, and that's where black people usually do their funerals on Saturday. We wait until we can get everybody together so we can. But the point I make is that where we would not have even considered cremation, now it is becoming more and more because of finances and the like, that individuals in the black church, they believe in that. I say that so that so much of the times at which we live now are so different. I heard you talk about morality. The moral situation, especially as a pastor in my community, I've been a counselor, what have you, and I've just seen so many things change in the course of my ministry. I'm retired now. But one of the things I had to deal with at the close of my official ministry was dealing with the matter of transgenders coming to worship. Prior to that time, I just was, that was not in my purview. But then that became a big thing, so much so that I had to deal and wrestle with my theology in terms of service. You talk about service. How do I serve this present age in terms of people who, going for me, it was so different, so vastly different from the way I was brought up. So there's a struggle in the church. I can tell you that, not what I think, but I tell you what I know. And so my thoughts are just a commentary that we live in a different age where the mores and folkways are so different from when I first started out. And so our approach to death, in terms of where I stand and where we grew up, is so vastly different.
Thank you, Reverend. I'm going to come back to you, David, in one moment. If there is a student that would like to make a statement, I have one microphone over here. If you can come over here, we want to get you on record. I want to ask Rich Purnell from the Embry-Riddle from Human Resources if he could make a comment or question.
Thank you. I must tell you that I came in with a couple of what I thought were well thought out questions, and they have been blown out of the water. I have about 3 dozen more that have been developed simply from the conversation. And it strikes me that this venue that we're in, conversational venue, with an openness and a consideration for different points of view, I think is one of the key elements that might be missing in the institutions, whether it's companies, higher education, the ability to listen to the other person's side of the story without judgment or bias, and that might be a sign of maturity. But what struck me was the comments around popular culture. Pick a time in history, and at that moment, the culture was popular, whatever it was. And so I'm wondering specifically about the concept of civility. Civility, as most of our institutions, it's a social contract. It's an understanding based in some sort of criteria that we all agree to. And I'm interested in your thoughts on the evolution of civility, going back as far as you'd like to go, the ups and downs, And was there a time when the civil contract was at a higher level? And I use those qualitative terms loosely.
Yeah.
Because turning on the television now, one might think that civility has lost its way a bit.
That's a loaded question, huh? Turn off the television. That's
Well, I've tried to. I think that's a very astute comment, for sure.
How does it improve conversation, too? I think Rich was talking with me about this. If we're more civil, I mean, does it improve the conversation or not?
Absolutely. Well, certainly. I think it's eye-opening. It can be bonding, bonding across differences or across political divides. There's one side of me that thinks America has this great tradition of civility, civil discourse. For me, some of that in terms of my studies ties into a concept known as civil religion, right? This is a famous notion from the 60s. A sociologist of religion, Robert Bellah, wrote about American civil religion that sort of brought in this notion of the civil into the religion of nationalism, the religion of sort of patriotism to some degree. But the other side of me also realizes that American history is also fraught with uncivility, with a history of slavery, a history of mistreatment of Native Americans, of Catholics in the early 19th century. I mean, unfortunately, American history doesn't live up to the ideals that we sometimes associate with civility and with certain kinds of key principles. So, I highly value places where people can actually think together about questions that aren't so tied to, what's your position on this political issue or that political issue. But instead, you talk about, how have I changed as a result of the death of my mother? Or, how do different cultures understand the meaning of health and healing? I mean, there are certain ways that I think the topics can bring civility to the conversations that actually can be very beneficial and socially valuable.
Good evening. Thank you. Your question right into the microphone now. Your question for Dr. Laderman.
One of the things that I've encountered a lot at this university that's been rather frustrating for me is that so many students are so focused on their own disciplines, engineering, flying airplanes, being a mechanic, whatever it may be, that they're reluctant to look beyond their own field and address not even just the big questions as we've discussed them tonight, but also the difficult questions that face us now in society. So from your experience as a professor and working with people my age, what's just one or two effective ways to help encourage people to face, and not to face, but to engage in these discussions?
Yeah. Well, this seems to be a great forum for that. And there are not a lot of students here. So it's one forum. Again, I think there are certain topics that will immediately resonate with students. And so finding ways to bring students together to really kind of explore and delve into those topics might be one avenue. I mean, you have certain constraints in terms of the courses you have to take and, what kind of requirements you have and the areas of specialization that are here. So that has to be balanced out in some way with, I don't know what to call them, spaces of reflection that, can be times when students who are in various disciplines and areas can come together and talk about religion and science fiction, or religion and health or something.
Thank you.
Yeah, I understand the difficulties.
I would like to get your question in, and then I'm going to come over to David Keck. Right into the microphone, please.
My question is ethics, like for myself, do you think it's more come from a religion or from your culture?
Ethics?
Yeah. Like what drives you to make a moral or an ethical decision? Do you think it's more religious based, or is it based on culture or a subculture that you may be involved with? What do you think?
Good question.
I was going to say, good thing we're not giving prizes out, because
Yeah, no,
that's the question of the night.
I don't know if I have the answer, but I would say I think religion is a part of culture, and ethics are very much tied to the world in which we live, and how we are shaped by sort of important, significant forces in our lives. And, religion may be one, but as I've mentioned, I think for many people, religion, as it's traditionally understood, may not be as compelling for many people. And so culture, which can be religious, may also then play a role, I think, more and more in how people understand what is good, what is right, what kind of life should I live.
So is it fair to say that if one abandons their faith, the culture may be the controlling interest?
Well, or it's not so separate. Sometimes the faith shapes the culture, and even there's that sort of bleeding into culture that different religions can do, especially in American society. So it's not so separate. Again, religion and culture, they're very much tied together.
Yes, please.
What if it's people who don't associate as being religious, but they're spiritual?
Yeah.
Like I find out they're separate. People who believe they're spiritual and people who believe in religion, they don't associate with each other.
Right.
So, like you said, the culture can be religion or the religion could be culture.
Yeah.
So, what if you're spiritual? So, I'm assuming if you're spiritual, you derive from different, maybe like a subculture, or from books, or from speaker,
Yeah.
So
That's another acronym we use, SBNR. Spiritual but not religious.
More people identify themselves in the younger generation as spiritual,
Yeah.
not religious.
Right. And it goes back to that question in our radio interview about churchy. I mean, it's a turn away from institutions and tradition, singularly defined, and wanting more freedom. I mean, although I wouldn't reduce it to this, it's very much reflective of the intense consumer culture we live in, across the spectrum. We all want it customized to our tastes and our personalities. And that's not to denigrate it, but spirituality has that kind of freedom where you can take a little Catholicism, a little Native American spirituality, a little Kabbalah, or whatever. And then spirituality then, can be a combination of things, or, it can be something more personal and subjective. But to me, yeah, that's where a lot of the action is in American society.
Why not? You're on a roll. You're on a roll. Go.
Okay, so back to spirituality. You said before that most, millennials compare themselves to be more.
I just want to get you on mic. I want them to hear every word. Go right in.
You said before that mostly, people my generation, millennials, are more spiritual, associated with spiritual because they're not as connected to a church.
Right.
Or whatever. So do you think young people associate themselves as being religious because they don't know maybe what church to go to, or they are maybe tainted, I guess, from learning from history? Like, I'm not saying that is, but I'm just saying like, the church may be the biggest business in America.
Yes.
So do you think maybe people, young generation, maybe try to disassociate themselves with that? Or you think that influences them why they're spiritual? But maybe they don't know. They could be religious, but they don't know because they don't go to church or temple or...
Yeah, well, I think millennials, but I would also say baby boomers as well. It's not just confined to millennials.
No, yes, I mean.
I think it's definitely crossing some generations that are post-60s. right? And I was talking earlier, I mean, to me, the 60s, 1960s, just is the pivot. There's a before the 60s and an after the 60s when it comes to religious history. And so this is very much tied to that kind of questioning of authority and of especially traditional religions, but also a kind of growing interest in comparative religion and learning about these different religions and learning about the history of religions. And in this particular age, internet especially gives it all at the fingertips. You want to learn the history of the Catholic Church? Well, there's a lot of elements to it, or the history of Islam, or the history of Judaism. So with all of that, you have, I don't know if it's information overload, but you have a lot of bits of knowledge, and I would, echo that comment that I think the younger people especially are more aware of these things, and that it may turn them off to traditional religion and contribute to that sense of seeking, or the freedom to explore and combine different religious cultures.
Thank you. Let me come back to you, because I want to come over to David. We're going to set you up with your own program. David, I wanted to give you an opportunity. Then Anka, I'm going to come over to you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your talk tonight, and I know we're going to hear from Anka in a minute too, and I know she's one of several faculty here who work really hard to incorporate the big questions, to use tonight's phrase, into their teaching, whether it's College of Business, College of Engineering. And I guess one of the questions I have is, as a chair of a department, you've overseen curriculum development. One of the conversation with the students earlier was exactly about the curriculum, limitations of courses, and things like that. And I'm wondering, as we think about our work here as a university, which does have specific curriculum for different programs, I think you met one of our AMS students who described just how many courses they have to take for that program, and engineering curriculum that requires a lot of courses. We don't have a lot of electives. Is there a way to think about how to, or let me rephrase this, as you think about the curriculum the students go through your curriculum at Emory, do you get the sense that they have to go through several different courses till they finally start getting excited about the big questions, or do you find that some come in right away asking questions? Do you find that there's a sort of a typical sequence that is meaningful, where you can lay a foundation in sort of the 101 course, and then by the time they get to the upper level courses, they're able to do some critical thinking? Or just kind of, are there ways of thinking about the intersections of curriculum and what we could do in our context with a limited flexibility that might be a little unusual from Emory's perspective, but might be helpful for us here?
We're trying to figure it out too. I think how to incorporate courses that might be more focused on the big questions, whether it's religion or philosophy or some of these other areas or disciplines, is a challenge. Again, it goes back to enrollment and thinking about how do we get students enrolled and in the classes. And we don't have a real fine-tuned sort of trajectory for our majors or our students. But we're trying to focus especially on the Religion 101, the Introduction to Religion course, as an important hook, to get them into appreciating the kinds of questions that we would ask, in our department. So it's strategic thinking about especially the lower level courses, 100, 200 level courses, where you can really hopefully draw a big crowd and then bring them more squarely into these deeper, more critically focused courses.
Thank you.
Yeah.
From the College of Business, Professor Anka Arnott, who has been in 2 of our events over the years when we've talked about ethics and business, and joins us tonight.
Okay, so thank you very much. So what David was talking about, I'm thinking we want to sign a conversation about, or discourse about, religion, spirituality, who am I in this universe and how do I fit in a particular course? And I think that may be somewhat in itself rather problematic. I see much value in phasing that in across the curriculum. So why can we not discuss this in the scope of an engineering course, right? And I think that's where the then deep discourse can happen. How is what this technical knowledge that I'm learning fit into who am I as a person and why am I here and why am I even contemplating this problem? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I applaud that. And that's challenging, but it also requires a broadening of the definition of religion. I mean, that's sort of front and center what I do, sort of bring that right out. What is the definition of religion? And you can bet we won't all agree on it.
Yeah,
and so to have that sort of broadening allows you to understand that religion, from one perspective can be not compartmentalized, but is a part of the curriculum. It's a part of so many aspects of our life in ways that we often don't think about. So.
And I applaud you, and I'm learning a lot from our conversation here, but I think as professors frequently you have this need to impart knowledge and to tell students what is right from wrong instead of just asking the right questions. I've learned that from my neighbor here, Rich Purnell, is ask the right questions in your course. Yeah. So there's conversation, there's discourse, and that's where then the learning occurs. And I think, then students will bring up the things that are relevant to them, and then you can feed into that conversation. I also think that's problematic in universities that are so focused on imparting knowledge and where faculty are afraid, because this is ambiguous territory, yeah. Right? So now I'm asking these questions, and all of a sudden now I'm going to have to manage and wiggle in this space of ambiguity. How do I do that effectively as faculty?
Oh, you're asking me that?
Yeah. Yes.
You're really on the spot now.
No, I'm pretty front and center with saying I don't want to have anything to do with that. I don't want to have anything to do with your personal spiritual evolution in this class or what your personal views are. It's very ideal in its own way, and I know it's impossible, but I try to kind of distinguish sort of your own existential learning through the topics, which is, again, that's not what I'm in this setting interested in, but it's another kind of learning that is, tied to history, kind of anthropology, religious studies, things like that. So I very self-consciously, intellectually avoid the personal.
Just to follow up, is that largely because you are a religious historian and that you don't want to leave that area? That's why you've chosen to do that. Rich, you want to give additional viewpoint based on Anka's comments? Or another question, go ahead.
Well, I go back to your comment about a Ku Klux Klan member in your class. Did you say that you would shut down that conversation?
Yeah. I feel I would. I haven't had that. I'm just kind of throwing that out there, thinking about limits and boundaries.
Well, the question that came to my mind was in the context of civility and consideration, consider it as a possibility. Is it possible, or under what conditions would it be possible to have a civil conversation with someone diametrically opposed from your personal beliefs, a Nazi member, Klan member, and be more concerned with the process of the conversation and its surrounding civility, devoid of the content?
Right. Yeah, I think you have to think about all of those dynamics and think about the specific setting of a classroom and its purpose and value. And think about the students who are in the class and the purpose of the class itself. I teach U.S. religious history, so we talk a lot about the KKK and look at it historically. How can you not, right? But again, in my approach to teaching, maybe it's part of my general personality of conflict avoidance. But, you know, I mean, your personal views, they're not part of our understanding of the history of American religion. And so if you start bringing in, you know, I believe this to be so, in terms of whatever racial differences, you know, that's not going to help in enriching our knowledge about U.S. religious history. There might be a political science course where they can talk about that, or, you know, I mean, you know, I think, is there a possibility for a space in the university to have that kind of conversation? Maybe, I'm not sure.
We have precious minutes left. John, one more question.
Thank you very much. I'm a graduate student here in the business school at Embry-Riddle, and actually I have about 30 pages of questions here, so I'm going to try to consolidate that to, I'm going to sneak in one question with two parts.
Okay.
The first question that I have is, at what stage do you believe that religion, however you define religion, or spirituality should enter the educational discussion? In other words, by the time you get to the university level, is it too late? Does it need to come in an earlier stage? And number two is, when you teach religion, how do you teach religion? Do you teach religion from a philosophical standpoint? Do you do the Houston Smith History of World Religion deal? I mean, what is the most, you know, efficacious way to teach the courses?
Yeah, thanks. Good, excellent. And I think a lot about that question. When do you start teaching comparative religion or some kind of scholarly or academic approach to the study of religion in terms of education? I've been asked to speak in classes, you know, with 8th graders about what I do, and that throws me off. I'm just not sure I should be there. I mean, I do. I feel uncertain about how young to go. I'm also very aware of the sort of questions of religion in public education. Certainly, that's been an issue in terms of legal history, and to think about in public schools. What's the difference between advocating and teaching? And those are important distinctions. So, and as I described, my own experience at Santa Barbara was very closed off in some ways to personal views. And so I'm not sure. I think I always ask my students who are in college if they've had some kind of course on religion, and most have absolutely not had a course. Some have in Catholic schools and some more private schools. Some will say mainly in the history class they might have encountered religion in some substantive way, but very few even today. So I don't know what the answer is. I think there's a value to learning that people have different religions early on. So, and then so that's just a quick one. How do I teach it? I mean, I'll quickly tell you, I teach my sexuality class and the death class exactly the same way. Okay? So the first third of both of those classes look at the topic in a cross-cultural view. So death in Hinduism, sexuality in Buddhism, death in Judaism. You know, we just sort of think anthropologically. I like to throw right at the get-go, get them to get outside of what is familiar, and just to kind of open up it's a very quick glimpse into the sort of world religions view. The second third of the course in my courses for both of those look at the topic in Christian history. So sexuality and the history of Christianity in the West. Death and the history of Christianity in the West. You know, from Christ to the Enlightenment and into the 19th century. And then the final third of the course is all America, and looking at the topic in American history and American culture, because I believe that, you know, it's all about getting students to have a better, critical, thoughtful understanding of the world they're living in. And so to me, those are good elements to kind of get them, and especially when we're talking about things that are so much a part of their lives and what they're thinking about.
Before we part company tonight, I want to thank Sun Tzu and Juliet for helping to seat everyone here tonight. Two of our students, and they come out and they support us in this series. Tony Petro, who ran things up in control. Chivalry Wu, who catches all this on video, and you will be able to see it on YouTube in the very near future. Thank you, sir, for your good work. When we come back in 3 weeks, cybersecurity, what's next for you? This is a remake from what we were going to do in October, but we were pushed aside by a hurricane, and we're merging forces. Two of our leading professors from Embry-Riddle, plus one from Daytona State College, will join us, and we'll talk about the changes in cybersecurity, and boy, do we have a lot to talk about. We hope you join us when we come back. March 27th, 7 o'clock, right here at the Lamon Auditorium. Doors will open at 6. Tell your friends. This is an important one. You want to be here. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, on behalf of Harry and Ada Lamon and Reverend David Keck, we thank you for being here. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Gary Laderman. Thank you for coming. Have a very pleasant good evening.